Chairman. First, I want to thank you all for having the hearing and for our witnesses. And this is a critical issue, not just with regard to the pandemic, but going forward. We need to change our approach. I agree with the chairman that there needs to be a mission that is clearly defined. I also agree and was struck by Dr. Gerberding's comments about the lack of consistent, accountable leadership. I've experienced some of that in dealing with the issues of PPP. But when you go from CDC to ASPR to DHS to FEMA to DLA, there is a lack of consistent leadership and certain accountability. And I know there's some interagency groups, as an example, Mr. Burrell talked about, that deal with the contents of the Strategic National Stockpile. But the problem is there doesn't seem to be consistent and accountable, and performance measures are not in place to be able to keep people accountable. So a mission's a good idea, but leadership to me is critical. I wondered, Dr. Gerberding, since you raised that issue, if you could comment on what that leadership ought to be, and perhaps Mr. Burrell, you could comment on that as well. Dr. Gerberding, are you there?
I'm on. Can you unmute me, please? Can you hear me now?
We can hear you.
Okay.
Tell us what your solution is in terms of leadership and accountability.
I wish it was that easy, sir. You know, as I tried to express, people think of the stockpile as a warehouse of stuff we buy and store, but it really is a capability. And there are different aspects of capability, and they may not all need to be under the same roof. For example, ASPR probably is the right place to do the contracting and procurement for novel countermeasures that need that NIH, BARDA, close interface for decision-making, prioritization, procurement, and management of those contracts and processes. But the stockpile utilization and planning is a very operationally driven effort. And to me, that's why you have operating agencies like the CDC, who's intimately connected with the users of the stockpile and is in a great position to be able to understand what are we aiming for, where are the gaps, and how do we plan, exercise, deploy, and improve our ability to be sure that the stockpile does meet the local requirements. So in my world, I think the accountability for the operational development, management, exercise, and deployment of the stockpile is best suited for an operating agency like the CDC, but the aspects of the contracting and procurement of these new and novel countermeasures and other things that may be on the innovation forefront, that's the kind of thing that ASPR and BARDA are really designed to do well. So, you know, it isn't a one-size-fits-all solution, but I think you can hold the accountability to the leaders who are responsible for their specific performance measures and requirements. And that's never really happened.
I'm going to ask you to think about that a little bit, because it seems to me you said leaders, plural. If no one's in charge, then it's very difficult to hold one entity accountable. So I would challenge you on that. And I think CDC, if you say that's the operational entity, it certainly didn't work this time. And we ended up in DLA because of that. So I would challenge you to just give us some more clear guidance as to how do you get exactly what you identified. I think is absolutely right that you need consistent, accountable leadership.
Senator, can I just very quickly come back to the point that's why we need the national strategy. And I do agree, one person needs to have the accountability. My own view is that person should be the director of the CDC, because that's been my experience and my framework for that. But that doesn't mean that other agencies don't have specific responsibilities. And I think it's that sort of have an accountable leader, plan horizontally, and make sure you execute vertically with the appropriate measures of success.
Yeah. Okay, well, that's helpful. I will say I'm also intrigued by what I've heard today about our lack of understanding of the needs for a pandemic like this, but also the reality that with regard to CBRN, you know, everything else out there that the stockpile was supposed to be for initially, including a nuclear attack, let's say, CDC may not be the right entity for that. It's the Center for Disease Control, not for a biological or nuclear attack, which would be more of a war footing. So anyway, I think we need to do some thinking about that, and we need to figure out what is the right leadership model to go along with the appropriate strategy. With regard to this issue of PPE in the stockpile, my great frustration is that we don't seem to be doing the obvious things to be able to reshore our PPE. And I would ask the question, I guess, of the entire panel here and see who would like to answer it. But do you agree, one, that we need a reliable source of PPE in the stockpile? And therefore, do you agree with me that we ought to be reshoring PPE? Not all of it, depending on, again, what we find is the real mission of the Strategic National Stockpile, but some of it, enough of it to be able to be reliable. By the way, in something like a global pandemic, you can't rely on global sources that you might otherwise, because they need the PPE also. We certainly have learned that in the last few months. I have a real frustration with the executive branch not providing long-term contracts, because for domestic reshoring, you've got to have the market signal that you're going to have a customer, and that customer is going to be the U.S. government in terms of the stockpile at the national level. It may be the states, it may be even some private sector entities that are given responsibility here, but we don't have that now. DLA is only issuing contracts for 90 days right now. So my question is, do you agree that we need to give industry this clear signal to build up our capacity? And do you think that it is necessary to have a reliable surge capacity?
Senator,
Dr. Harding, you're on the video, so what do you think?
I'll start just by saying that we have to understand from the standpoint of PPE that we are supply constrained. It doesn't really matter whether it's in the stockpile or whether it's in the healthcare system or the state. We have a supply constraint there. And that is the first and foremost thing we need to concentrate on remediating. And yes, I agree that the more we can build out our national capacity in that regard, the more secure we will be in the context of a global pandemic. Your other point about long-term contracting, I couldn't agree with more. As the company that just got an Ebola vaccine licensed and are under contract to fulfill a certain number of doses for a stockpile, what happens when that ends? We've built a factory to make this vaccine, and we're going to be sitting with idle capacity because there really is no future there.
Well, you won't have the investment, and I hope to hear from the other panelists as well, but I know my time is up. Let me just say that today I'm sending a letter to DLA along with 3 other Republicans and 3 Democrats, asking for them to change their policy with regard to the 90-day versus a long-term contract, so that U.S. companies can make that investment with certainty to be able to bring PPE back to our shores. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.